Joel, thanks so much for coming on today, man. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to jump on and talk to you.
For those that are unfamiliar with your work, and I hope many of them are familiar with you, but for those that aren't, could you, as best you can, give us a level perspective on how you got to where you are and why, in my opinion, you are one of the best when it comes to energy system development and overall performance in athletes?
Yeah, I mean, look, at this point, I've been in the industry over 20 plus years, coaching, using technology, doing a variety of different things. So it's hard to summarize that as briefly in a brief format, but I'll give you a real quick background story. I started really just kind of in college being super fascinated on the strength and conditioning side as a failed athlete, which I think a lot of us probably were in the field at some point, just couldn't quite make it as an athlete. And so I jumped into strength conditioning, worked with a guy named Bill Gillespie at the University of Washington football program. And most people may not know Bill, but he's benched like 1,000 pounds at age 60 years old or some just ridiculous number, just insanely strong human being. Followed him to the Seahawks for about a year, worked on that end, and then decided I didn't want to go the professional sport route because it's just so unpredictable and you are losing your job every few years and shuffling around the country. So I decided to open a gym when I was 23 years old called End Zone Athletics. And up to that point, I'd been really just a strength and power guy. I'd lifted heavy weights, and conditioning was kind of an afterthought that you did at the end of practice and the workouts. But I happened to open up next to an MMA gym called AMC Pancration, which turned out to be really the epicenter of mixed martial arts, which at the time was not a huge sport in the US, but it quickly grew. And so I started training fighters, and I realized very quickly when I went over to try to train with them, I got my ass kicked in 30 seconds, despite being overwhelmingly stronger than they were. I recognized how little I knew about conditioning and how much I had to know because these guys were performing at a high level. It wasn't like football where you have 11 guys on the field and you can't really pin everything on the strength conditioning coach. They're not usually getting the reward or the blame if the team doesn't perform well. But if a fighter goes out and gasses out in a fight, that's your job. That was what you were supposed to help them prevent. So I dove just headfirst into the energy system side of things and into understanding conditioning because I felt like these guys deserved, my best. And so I learned everything I possibly could. At the same time, I was introduced to heart rate variability, which now is well known, but back in the early 2000s when I was introduced to it, nobody knew what it was. And so as I was training these combat athletes and studying energy systems and conditioning, I was also learning the HRV, recovery, autonomic system side of things. And so my career has really been the intersection of those two things: high level conditioning across a wide variety of sports, as well as recovery, regeneration, heart rate variability technology, and all that side of it. And so over the last, like I said, 20 years, I've done everything from worked with a variety of different athletes to organizations like Lifetime Fitness and other big corporate groups and military groups and just different people on both those fronts. And I've also created education for coaches and big organizations. I launched my own HRV app, one of the first ones in 2011 called BioForce HRV, which evolved into one called Morpheus, which I have now. So I've played a lot of different roles, had a lot of different hats, but it's all really revolved around understanding how do we improve conditioning, how do we manage recovery, how do we increase performance through both of those, how do we use those to drive longevity and health and wellness and all those sorts of things. So that's kind of the shortest version I can give you.
And there is nothing lost on me there about the incredible work you have done. And I agree, the HRV side of things was really enlightening for me. Growing up, having an opportunity to explore some of those technologies and apps that you kind of brought to the industry. So it's cool to see how it's evolved into the Morpheus app, and certainly we'll talk more about that as we get down the road of fitness and performance training. But really, from a conditioning side, I think it's important to even just define what conditioning and/or fitness is, because I think they're
Sure.
used interchangeably. And I don't know if you use them interchangeably as well. If you would, from your perspective, distinctively define the difference between conditioning and fitness.
Yeah, look, I think that's part of the challenge of conditioning and even fitness as a whole is we lack common terminology in a lot of ways. When you say strength, people generally know what that means, how much weight you can lift in an exercise or get off the ground or whatever. People know how to define strength, but conditioning seems to be a lot more vague, and it's definitely not universally described in the same way. It's kind of like, you see it, but how do you actually put that into words? And so I've kind of developed my own framework for it that I think makes sense, at least to me, and how I coach it. And I would define fitness as a series of traits that we can specifically measure by different types of testing assessments. So I'd call a Vo2max a measure of fitness. I'd call an anaerobic thresholds measure of fitness. I'd call different strength measures, measures of fitness, mobility, these different types of physical qualities that we can actually test and assess and measure in a quantifiable way. To me, those are just measures of fitness, right? And we can say different types of athletes have different levels of different qualities of fitness. So a power lifter obviously has much higher levels of strength than aerobic fitness compared to an endurance athlete. But to me, the ability to have conditioning is your ability to use those fitness qualities to actually perform and to do something. And so we can see the difference in a lot of ways if we look at athletes who have great performance in the weight room, or maybe endurance athletes who have high Vo2max and these different metrics that we can, again, quantify. But then maybe they go out in the race or they go out in the performance and they don't actually end up performing at the level they should, given where their fitness qualities were at. So to me, conditioning is how do we put the whole piece together, the physical, the mental, the skill, all the different pieces of performance, and then go out and perform at a high level with it. So that's how I look. I kind of use the example of if I want to build a house, I can go out and buy all the construction materials. I could get all the different tools and things I need to build the house. But if I don't know how to build a house, I don't have a house. I just have the tools. And it's a very similar process. If I go out and build all these fitness qualities, but I don't really put them together within the context of my skill and the context of my performance, the context of what I have to do, then my level of performance is not going to be what it should be given my fitness. And so that's kind of how I've defined it. And that's how I look at it. We develop fitness qualities primarily through training in the gym, but we have to do more than just build a high Vo2max in the gym or just build a certain level of strength in particular lift to actually translate those lifts or that in the weight room into performance in the real world. So I separate it and look at it that way.
I had a recent guest on here, Dave Tenney. We talked a lot about tactical
Oh yeah, I've known Dave for a
periodization.
long time.
Yeah, you guys probably up in Seattle area have gotten to know each other quite a bit. The concept of tactical periodization, Dave and I talked quite a bit about, and as you're describing how you define fitness and conditioning, that's what kind of came to mind. So just curious if you have any familiarity with that subscription of methodology, and if there's anything there that you find similar or different to how you create your own framework.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think if you look backwards towards like the Russian and the Eastern European frameworks, they really kind of broke the stuff down to what they'd call, general physical preparation versus special physical preparation or tactical preparation, however you want to quantify that. But they essentially said the same thing, that there's broad qualities you build through general means, and then there's very specific qualities and properties and ability to actually execute and apply that general fitness that you've developed. So that I think that framework has been around for a long time, and you can break it down in different qualities. You can use slightly different terminology of technical, tactical, all these different types of preparation, but it just all boils down to the body can develop things broadly across different physiological parameters. But then at the end of the day, to perform at a high level, you have to do more specific things for the body to be able to do what you want it to do in the context of the environment of whether it's competition or life or whatever the case may be. So I think that's just a framework that makes sense based on how the body adapts world around it.
What would be like some contextual examples here of, I heard you talk about general adaptations that we all need versus the specificity when it comes to whether you're an MMA fighter, a soccer player, a basketball player. How would you maybe provide some simple examples of the general versus the specific qualities?
Yeah, so good question. I mean, I think again, if we look at what are the basic qualities of an NBA player or a basketball player, like they're all going to be able to have some specific levels of vertical jump, explosiveness, right? If you don't have that basic level of explosiveness, you're probably not going to be an NBA player because you're going to be too slow in the court. Just because somebody can jump really high in a vertical line doesn't mean they can sprint down the court, shuffle, move around the athletes, have a complete game. And so a lot of it comes down to how do we develop those qualities? Do we develop vertical jump purely on plyo boxes, or do we do court drills, or do we do a combination of both, or do we then incorporate that into technical, tactical, game of actual playing basketball in different formats and practice? And it's this continuum. I think that's the best way to look at this is we have to develop the basic physiological qualities an athlete needs, whether it's vertical jump or straight line sprinting or mobility to just move and execute the skills. And then we have to progress that into the skill training and development. Then you have to develop the technical side of things where you're actually working in a functional unit as a team. So it's just everything is a progression. I would say you have to always look from the bottom up or top down and recognize the qualities you develop in one sense have to then be transferred into the actual sport itself. So you could look at a squat as a base example into a jump into an actual skill in the sport. Those are all progressions of one another.
There's this recent perspective I've had, and this is just having working more specifically with a particular technology company that being involved and how they're starting to put out a lot of normative reports around a lot of technology that they have. And the question I have for you around normative information, again, normative data being bell curves, and there's always outliers. But what I've started to observe with, let's just, you mentioned the ability to jump, and what I've started to observe across CMJ metrics, regardless of sport, there tends to hover around some baselines or standards across all athletes that tend to be consistent. So, you talked about general principles of conditioning, and I'm just wondering here, huge fan of the episode you did on Peter Attia's podcast and, Peter's work in longevity space and really encouraging Vo2max and zone 2, which I know you've been preaching, you call it aerobic output and cardiac output as well. So relative to like standards of, and normative data, when you talk about general qualities, are there just certain general standards I don't want to blanket this and say all athletes,
Sure.
but hey, like we're just looking at something as specific as a Vo2max. Is it fair to say specificity really shouldn't matter until Vo2max hits a certain threshold? Is that a reasonable idea, or am I like out of line in thinking that we'll ever get there?
I mean, it's hard to say one thing has to be, at a certain level, but I would say, just speaking extremely broadly across, again, 20 years of looking at data across a wide variety of athletes as well as just high level people, I can tell you the one thing I've seen that tends to be almost universally across the board is people's resting heart rates, which is, again, a very broad marker of general aerobic fitness. It across team sport athletes, across even stuff like pole vault, which is, a very anaerobically driven thing. You almost always see people's resting heart rates fall within like a 7 to 8 beat per minute window of like upper 40s, low to mid 50s across all of these different things. So there is something to be said for like, you just need this base level of aerobic fitness. And it's not even for the sport itself necessarily. I think we forget that the training for the sport is often more volume and more intensity in different ways, I should say, than the sport itself, right? So a pole vaulter, for example, they're only doing one pole vault at a time, which is a few seconds, and it's clearly almost entirely anaerobic, very little aerobic activity, but doing hundreds of reps and doing all the training and all the things go into that has a much bigger aerobic component. The recovery has a big aerobic component. So, I don't know about, you can't really say broadly like everyone has to have some minimum VO2, but maybe they do. I just don't know what it is. I would just say that across a huge domain, I find that without, not with exception, I say with definitely some exceptions, this aerobic level fitness where we see aerobic, we see resting heart rate upper 40s, low to mid 50s, like that just seems to hold true across a much bigger spectrum than you would think it would, given that it's such a broad marker of a lot of different levels of aerobic fitness. So there's definitely some baseline stuff, and that's probably the closest I've come to seeing, what the general requirement is for people to perform at high levels.
You mentioned resting heart rate. I brought into the conversation Vo2max. Sounds like resting heart rate would be, hey, that'd be the keystone, maybe like level one, like let's address that. If you had a hierarchy of biometrics you would prioritize, you mentioned HRV, you've mentioned some conditioning outputs as well. With the availability of fitness trackers and the availability of apps like yours, such as Morpheus or other popular wearables such as Apple Watch or Oura Ring, how would you prioritize, all the metrics that are available? And so keeping in line with, the framework of conditioning, I don't want to go down the space of health and longevity here, but what would you prioritize as like, hey, focus on these biometrics and monitor these over time with your interventions?
Yeah, look, I think, like I mentioned, average resting heart rate is a really good place to start. Now, again, I want to have one caveat. If you're talking like a power lifter or Olympic weightlifter, those tend to be a bit higher resting heart rates because they're so anaerobic. But broadly speaking, I think resting heart rate, average heart rate variability, heart rate recovery, all those things that just give us these general guidelines of aerobic fitness is really the place to start because, like I said, the training and the competition might not always be the same, but you're going to need a decent level of aerobic fitness to train and compete across almost every sport, aside from the ones that, I've just mentioned. Then, you have to look at basic movement capacity. If somebody can't move, then they're not going to perform particularly, well, they're going to compromise themselves. And that's more on where you guys, I think, look at the PT world, the therapy world is, making sure people have basic movement competencies across different movement patterns. It's just going to keep them functionally moving and healthy and able to train. But the two easiest, like I said, average resting heart rate, average HRV. If you can get those where you want them to be, it just makes everything else easier because they're going to recover faster. They can have higher train volumes. They're less likely to get injured. They're likely to be able to actually execute their skills over a longer period of time without fatigue. All those things come with just developing, however you want to call it, a base aerobic fitness, or however you want to use the terminology, but you need that to be able to train at a high level. If you don't have it, that's really the place to start because everything else is compromised if you don't.
I think a lot of people are familiar with what a resting heart rate is, and more folks are starting to be exposed to the HRV and the heart rate recovery. But could you briefly define what the HRV and the heart rate recovery is?
Sure. Heart rate variability is, it's funny because heart rate variability has been around since literally like the 50s and 60s. It was used in the space program for the Russians to send the first cosmonaut to space and understand what happens when you send people to space. But without going too far down the scientific rabbit hole, you've got your autonomic nervous system, which people are probably familiar with. You've got your fight or flight system, the sympathetic branch of that. You've got we call it rest and digest, or rest and recovery, or whatever you want to call it, the parasympathetic nervous system. And our body is constantly manipulating the controls of those systems to interact with the world around us, to perform something stressful like a workout or competition, and to recover from that afterwards. But also just to deal with mental stress and environmental stress and everything else. Your body is constantly turning up the dials on those and turning down the dials on those two systems. So when we need more energy right now and we need to be in some sort of a heightened state of energy production, our body will crank up the dial on that sympathetic system. It'll turn down the dial on that parasympathetic function so that we can go do what we need to do and perform and produce energy. Now, after we've done whatever it is that we're doing that we needed that for, our body's going to reverse course. It's going to turn down that sympathetic dial and it's going to turn up that parasympathetic dial so we can drive more energy into recovery and regeneration and adaptation, all those sorts of things. So I say this because what we are measuring with the autonomic nervous system on a heart rate variability standpoint is that parasympathetic nervous system's activity. We're understanding what it's doing at baseline. We don't really measure heart rate variability when we're active, because when we're active, there's just very little of it. We're seeing almost predominantly or almost entirely entirely sympathetically driven output. So we would just see low heart rate variability. It wouldn't really tell us much. So we measure heart rate variability generally at rest, and we're getting an insight window into what that baseline level of parasympathetic function is. So it's, where is our body at? Is it trying to really drive recovery and regeneration because we've done something stressful? Is it more in a neutral state because we've already gone through that whole process? And looking at that just gives us a very good idea of where we're at in this process of stress, recovery, and adaptation. But even more than that, the baseline number, just your average number over time, kind of where you sit, shows us that resting tone or that baseline function of that autonomic nervous system. And so somebody who has, or that parasympathetic nervous system, I should say, somebody who has higher baseline HRV is going to, generally speaking, be better at adapting to stress. They're better at turning off that sympathetic dial when they don't need it. They're better at directing energy into recovery when they do. And they're generally able to have more work, more training load, more everything else, and still adapt to it in a positive way and recover from it. So that's why it's a really valuable number, because it gives us an idea of how much somebody can train. And then we look at the daily changes back and forth. We're seeing how much stress we're putting on the system, and we see a great number of change and a big variability in that system, which, and it sounds variability, but when we're seeing a lot of variation in HRV and it's bouncing all over the place and it's going up and down and have big changes, that tells us the body's under a lot more stress. If it's fairly stable and more consistent and changing much less, the body's under less stress and it's adapting in a more positive way. So we can look at HRV from both the long term, where's our average HRV, and is it going the right direction? If we want it to go up, is it going up? Is it going down? Where is it at? And then that daily picture of variation tells us how much stress our body's under and whether or not we're adapting in a positive way or negative way. And again, that just helps us guide our coaching, our rehab decisions, and everything else.
If you were providing deliberate stress, through a training interventions, whether it's, rehab or conditioning, your MMA fighters, your brand is 8 weeks out, right? They're 8 weeks out. You would expect to see some changes in the HRV. So how do you manage when the intention is to induce stress, to induce adaptation for preparation, versus monitoring stress and seeing the changes that may not fall in line with what you're hoping to see that is concurrent with the intervention you may be applying as a coach? How do you decipher between those two scenarios?
Sure, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of it comes down to just coaching as an individual and understanding what each individual person's normal versus abnormal is, looking at other things along with, not just the HRV. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? You should see if someone's going the wrong direction, like you should also see the changes from a negative standpoint in their training. They're not getting better, or worse, would be that they're going the wrong direction. But you also just have to, again, look at the data over time and understand for each individual person, because different people have different genetic background, different genetics in general. They're going to have different levels of what's normal change for them versus what's abnormal change for them. And that's part of why Morpheus looks at standard deviation. So what Morpheus does is looks at where you are now relative to where you've been over the last 7 days, and it looks at standard deviation. So for some people, in Morpheus, at least a 2 to 3 point swing might be totally normal. For other people, that might be abnormal. It's going to look at where your normal variation lies, and it uses that to calculate your recovery score, if you will. But it really also, the hard thing about HRV is different systems are calculating it using different metrics and different calculations. They're displaying it in different scales, more or less. They're doing different filtering. So it's really hard to say HRV should always be within this range on a daily basis, because on one system, a 10-point change might be a lot. On another system, a 10-point change might be nothing. So you really can't make universal statements about, oh, this is a normal change in HRV, this is an abnormal change in HRV. You really have to, again, treat it, each person as an individual on the system that they're using, and spend some time getting to know what's a normal level of change, what's an abnormal level of change. And then again, it should line up with what you're seeing observationally of their skill, performance, of their training, all those sorts of things.
I'm glad you brought up the variability. Like you said, you keep using the word variability. Yeah. The variability across the apps, because I've even noticed between using the Morpheus and using just an Oura ring, and they're calculating and collecting, not only just a calculation, the collection of the HRV is two totally different things. Yeah. One using chest heart rate strap, the other being through a finger. So that in and of itself creates different scores. So I appreciate you calling that out. That just leads me to this next curiosity of mine is when we start talking about the wearables of, like you have the Oura ring, you have an Apple Watch, you have Polar that has like the optical sense that goes on a forearm. You've got the chest strap that which Morpheus is. You also have, things like a Whoop band. I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but you sparked my curiosity here. I'm just curious, like, where does the validity and reliability and maybe prioritizing which ones are going to be best to really get the biggest bang for your buck, both from a convenience and an accuracy perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's the first one is really easy. From an accuracy standpoint, there is no question that the chest strap is the most accurate in every possible scenario, whether you're measuring heart rate variability, whether you're working out, whether you're doing anything really. The chest strap is using electrical signals. It's accurate to plus or minus 1 millisecond if it's calculating the different distance between R intervals, which is we use for HRV. It is the gold standard, aside from like a 6 or 12 lead ECG. Like you're not going to get more accurate than the chest strap in the real world setting, because you're not going to walk around with ECG leads on you. Optical sensors, and again, Morpheus has had optical sensors in the past. To be honest, they're all over the place, because they're functionally measuring something different. They're measuring blood flow changes beneath the device that's measuring, using lasers that shoots in and it measures basically the reflection back, and that looks at how much blood's flowing through. So they're using what's called PPG. It's a different type of methodology to estimate both heart rate and the R interval, which leads to HRV. And so the accuracy can vary tremendously based on the sensor. That's part of the challenge. The Morpheus sensor we used have been validated to be plus or minus 2 milliseconds, which is still more than accurate enough to do HRV, but it's obviously less accurate than 1 millisecond. The challenge with PPG sensors, optical sensors, just call it that, is they're subject to what are called motion artifacts. So if you move your limbs at all, you get what are called motion artifacts in the data, and it becomes much harder for those to be filtered out. And that's basically what happens, is you have to filter out data. And that's why, if you're wearing an armband, you go do a high intensity workout, you move your arms really quickly and you rapidly change direction, and there's a huge potential there for inaccuracies. The bigger apps that have lots of money, Apple Health and Garmin, they try to smooth some of those out when you're training, so you don't see massively erratic numbers in there. But when you're measuring HRV, you can't see what's happening. That's the problem. It's kind of this black box. If you wear an Oura, a Whoop, or whatever overnight, you have no idea how accurate that data is. You're just getting one number at the end of the night, and that's an average of the last 6 or 8 hours when you're sleeping, you really don't know how accurate the data is. And the answer is we don't really know, because there's been very little research on that, and there's been even less research that wasn't funded by the companies that were trying to do the research. So again, I personally think, just my opinion after a long time of doing this, is optical sensors for a training perspective are fine if you're doing relatively low to moderate intensity, very cyclical type of normal movements. But as soon as you get in the higher intensity ranges, as soon as you start moving rapidly and changing direction, doing athletic things, optical sensors are garbage in a lot of those scenarios. And if you wear a chest strap, compare that, you will see that pretty clearly, that you just it misinterprets a lot of data, particularly if people have darker skin, if they have tattoos, if the thing is loose and it's not tight enough, it moves around. Like, you just do not get good workout data with optical sensors at high intensities. It's just the reality of it. I know they're more comfortable maybe, or people like them, but if you're trying to get accurate data from a workout perspective, it's just not going to happen. I think from a heart rate variability standpoint, it depends what you're trying to measure. I think the overall longitudinal changes that you would see on something like a URA or Whoop or whatever, I think those longitudinal changes are valid. If you're trending up over time, that's valid. If you're trending down over time, that's valid. But I've seen enough data to be mostly convinced that there's not much utility in the daily change in an optical sensor worn overnight. I just think it's not accurate enough, and it doesn't reflect what we want it to well enough to say definitively, like, this is where you are today and this is where it's really meaningful. I just don't buy that data based on everything I've seen. Again, I think it still can be valuable from an awareness standpoint, but I would not look at an URA morning measurement and say, oh, our measurement in the morning from last night's data, compare it to yesterday's, and be convinced that that difference is exactly right or meaningful in a way that I would go use. So that's why we really focused on the chest strap with Morpheus, because I want to have the most accurate data possible. And part of that means actively measuring it in a standardized format versus just wearing it overnight and seeing what the average was across the last 6 or 8 hours. I want to see where the sleep cycle actually finished up and where someone's HRV was at that moment in time. The same way as I'd want to measure someone's weight first thing in the morning. If I was trying to look at how much their weight was changing over time, I wouldn't randomly, sporadically measure it over an 8-hour period and calculate the average. That wouldn't tell me enough about their weight to really understand on a daily basis how it's changing. Again, it would probably line up longitudinally, but it wouldn't give me enough information on a daily basis to make decisions about calorie intake or output. So, it's a tricky thing, because there are so many devices out there. There is something said for convenience and form factor and all those sort of things. But I think if somebody really wants the most accurate data possible, the chest strap is the way to go.
And I certainly agree with that, because I lost sight of that perspective. I was trying to go more convenience factor for a while and just relying on the Apple Watch, and I was incredibly frustrated that I couldn't get my heart rate higher into like a true zone 4, zone 5, and then next thing I know, I put a heart rate strap on. It's like, oh no, like we're there. It's like you mentioned, all the motion artifact, the accuracy. So I just want to share that small anecdote
they will filter out data to try to prevent it from showing you a really inaccurate number, and that filtering gets higher and worse the higher heart rate you get. So you cannot rely on optical sensors at high heart rates or high velocities. It's just not good.
Well, the final metric I just wanted your perspective on. Wanted to just define it, but then I just want to revisit it, because it's been a while since working in soccer for several years. Heart rate recovery was something we looked at. Match day minus match day plus 2. But I've got away from looking at it and starting to just revisit it. So could you want to just define what heart rate recovery is and the appropriate intervals to look at, and then physiologically, what are we learning about someone when we get our measurements at the appropriate intervals? Like, what is that telling us about either the recovery or the current status of that athlete?
Yeah, like heart rate recovery, I should say. We've said it so many times. Heart rate recovery is undervalued, in my opinion, because it tells you a lot of really good information in a very, very simple protocol of just seeing how many beats per minute someone's heart rate drops over a given time. I mean, the kind of common research-driven thing you'll see a lot of times, a 60-second heart rate recovery. So you do a period of exertion, you measure how much the heart rate drops in 30 or 60 seconds, and that's 60-second heart rate recovery. But you also see shorter periods. 30 seconds is used out there a bit, even as short as 10 seconds is out there. And obviously it depends somewhat contextually on what you're doing, right? If you're actually driving yourself to max heart rate, that's different than if you're at 70% of it, and then you measure recovery. But broadly speaking, we're looking at two things, and they're both very interesting. The one is, when we go back to what I just talked about, when we're driving high levels of energy, we're turning up that sympathetic dial. But as soon as we don't need that, that dial should start to come back down pretty quickly. And that parasympathetic system should to turn up, right? You should decrease hormonal production. You should start to bring the all the different things you've screwed up homeostatically back towards normal. But if you've been in a high level of stress for a long time, that doesn't happen very quickly. That can take a longer period of time because you've got so many hormones running around the bloodstream. It takes a long time to clear those. And so if we look at just 60-second heart rate recovery or 30-second heart rate recovery, we're just looking at how good is the body at doing what it needs to and adapt by dropping heart rate and dropping that sympathetic activity and turning that parasympathetic system back on to facilitate recovery. The better somebody is at that, generally speaking, the better they're going to be at sustaining power output over longer periods of time, because the more time you spend those high heart rates and those high outputs, the more you're going to fatigue, because you're spending more time anaerobically, you're driving more hormonal production, all these sorts of things that will fatigue us. So it's just a really good index of how much can someone sustain over time. Well, if their heart rate's coming down very quickly in between periods of work, they can probably sustain that for a fairly long period of time without slowing down. If they're constantly, being really high and you're seeing very little drop even during the resting period, then they're fatigued and they're not going to sustain it very long without slowing down further and further. The second thing, which is also equally interesting and really just ties into the first, is there's research now, and a decent amount of it will show you heart rate recovery is directly linked to how much of that work period was aerobic versus anaerobic, which makes sense. If a given, let's say you do a 30-second sprint or whatever, if that sprint was almost largely driven by the anaerobic system, it's going to take you a lot longer to recover from it than if more of it was aerobically driven. So it's just a marker of aerobic fitness in some sense, applied aerobic fitness, I should say, because whatever you're doing, if it's more aerobic, you recover a lot faster from it and your heart rate comes down faster and your parasympathetic system turns on faster, all those sorts of things. It just makes sense because, broadly speaking, the higher you go anaerobically, the more that sympathetic dial has to crank way up, and then it takes it longer to come back down, and it takes it longer for the parasympathetic system to reactivate and turn on. So you're looking at, again, just a really good functional applied metric of how aerobically driven is somebody versus anaerobically. And if they're more anaerobically driven, the heart rate recovery is going to be lower. It's going to take longer for them to recover. They can't repeat that output as frequently before they fatigue, and all that comes with that. And so I used to use this all the time in combat athletes because, they have 3 5-minute rounds or 5 5-minute rounds, generally speaking. And I really want to know what was their heart rate recovery between rounds, because that was, to me, after measuring everything, the best gauge of whether or not they were going to be able to sustain that level of output across rounds 2, 3, or even 4 and 5 if it got in the championship rounds. And so I'd want to see someone, again, you have to also look contextually, someone standing versus seated in between rounds or during the recovery period. That's obviously going to change. Fighters would sit down between rounds, so I'd measure their heart rate variability, or so their heart rate recovery seated, and I'd want to see them get down to the 130s, 140s in between rounds in a competitive situation. You can't measure it in the actual fight, obviously, but when they were doing their sparring, when they were doing their training, I'd want to see them get down in that range consistently, because that was a good indicator that they were going to be able to go out in the next round and still have enough left to tank to go out and perform well. If they were staying in the 150s, 160s, or God forbid the 170s, they were going to go back out the next round and they were starting from a hole. They were going to fatigue much, much faster. And so that was one of the metrics I would always use is this athlete ready to go out and perform on fight night? Well, what is their heart rate recovery between their rounds and sparring during training? And the closer you get to fight, the more important that becomes, because you're obviously closer to where you're going to have to go perform. And so it was just a really, really good metric, particularly in that setting, because it literally is a sport with a 60-second rest period. It was very applicable in that scenario. But broadly speaking, the same concepts and the same model apply to a wide variety of sports that are repetitive power output with rest intervals. Any sort of alactic aerobic sport, or even somewhat lactic aerobic sport, has a period where they're going to have to rest and go out and perform. The further they can drop their heart rate in the rest period, the more likely they are to go out and repeat that performance without slowing down. It really is that simple.
A lot of the conversation so far around fitness and conditioning, we've been talking a lot about the heart rate variability, heart rate recovery, resting heart rate. There, I lost my train of thought there for a second. And so the other components that I'm curious on your perspective, if you have any insights that you can share with us. Yes, we're talking about heart rate, and the purpose of heart rate and improving conditioning is to deliver blood flow to tissues, right? And so the primary reason for that is to remove the CO2 and to deliver oxygen. And so the respiration component comes to mind, and also the peripheral tissue oxygenation comes to mind. So I don't want to jump into the weeds on those two topics, but as just to highlight that, yes, we've been talking a lot about the heart, but it's also important that respiration and peripheral oxygen exchange, gas exchange, I should say, not just oxygen, peripheral gas exchange is important. Like what insights or perspectives do you have around the respiration component and the gas exchange in the periphery?
Yeah, look, I think this comes back to what we talked about earlier, which is the general versus the specific component, right? So if I took a marathon runner, obviously a high level marathon runner is going to have a very low resting heart rate. They're going to have big left ventricle output. They're going to have all these things, but their actual ability to use that oxygen comes down to the movement patterns they've been doing, which is running. If I then put them in a pool, and let's say they had reasonable swim technique, they knew how to swim, they would be nowhere near the same level of athlete in the pool as they would running, because the musculature and the peripheral oxygen exchange and all those things would be specific to the movement pattern. They would not have the ability to then transform or take that high level of cardiac output and turn that into a highest level performance like they could in a marathon. So sure, there's the broad capabilities, but you have to turn that into the actual performance, which is where the specific component comes in. So this is where the movement pattern, the exercises, the breathing, all those sorts of things are that specific element like we've talked about. And that's why, again, you can't just develop this broad quality with doing exercise that's totally unrelated to sport and expect it to automatically transfer into the sport. This is why exercise selection, movement pattern, all that sort of stuff plays a key role in, again, taking the fitness we've developed and turning it into the conditioning that's going to actually lead to the performance we want.
Have you worked with triathletes in the past?
With triathletes?
Yeah.
A little bit here and there. Yeah. I mean, that's a challenging sport because of different demands, obviously, with these different movement patterns. And what you find is that, again, people will, generally speaking, be better at one versus the other two because maybe they're more inclined to it, or maybe they spent the most time in that particular domain. But it's a really good example of, the challenge of having to develop peripheral adaptations and peripheral use across different movement patterns. That's why it's such a hard sport.
No, it's exactly what you came to mind when you said swim and run. I'm like, oh, triathlon. Like, you're absolutely right. Someone they usually have one that they prefer, one that they like, and one that they despise.
Yeah, exactly. And that just comes down to where they're the most comfortable and where they've probably spent the most time, which is reinforced by where they're most comfortable. People in general tend to do what they're good at, most comfortable with, and struggle with the other areas across all sports, really. And that's part of the challenge, is identifying that, is where is someone lacking, and then finding a way to make it so they're actually able to do the things that make it less comfortable, so they'll do it more.
Excellent. I want to wrap this conversation up. I want to be mindful of your time, and I want to just leave an open-ended hypothetical, and hopefully it is enough insight for the audience. And I want to tie this into more, the return to play and rehab setting. I personally believe there's a lot of good performance coaches providing the fitness qualities and conditioning qualities that we need. But in the return to play, and especially like a post-op case, I think like an ACL reconstruction or a meniscus repair where, it's going to be a long-term rehab. I'm really just curious if you'd be willing to share kind of a framework and maybe how you would go about, if you had someone, you're working with a physical therapist and you're part of the plan of care day one post-op all the way up to competition, how you would plan and periodize a conditioning program for, and let's use the example of a popular surgery, that being an ACL reconstruction. And let's say we have a timeline of 9 months. I'd really just be curious if you could tell us the story that you would hope to create when creating this program for this athlete, in addition to all the rehab they have to do locally for that knee.
Sure. I mean, yeah, that's a very open-ended question. I think the biggest thing is we look at multiple variables, right? Number one, what fitness qualities has that athlete lost in their journey, right? If they can't move, they can't do certain movement patterns for weeks or months on end, and they're completely sedentary, like obviously your baseline aerobic fitness and your baseline work capacity is significantly diminished. And you have to start there by gradually building that back up in whatever capacity you can. So that's where understanding from the therapist and within the team, what are movement patterns that can be done during the early stages of just building some aerobic fitness and work capacity, or maintaining it if they, depending on the actual, procedure, versus what are ones we need to stay away from. So obviously the loading factors and the movement patterns, I think that should be what the therapist sets out. And that's where the conversation with the strength coach needs to happen, is what movements can we do? What movements should we avoid in the early stages? And then my goal is, again, starting to rebuild some of that aerobic fitness, using the metrics we've talked about, aerobic resting heart rate, HRV, those sorts of things, and being able to just do that in a very general manner. So I can do exercises that are very unrelated, but still developing that centralized component. That's probably step one, is just start down that path of getting somebody aerobically fit again, getting someone's work capacity up again, and then gradually building that, because that's what you lose the most, is just this work capacity, this adaptability. I'm going to spend as much time as I can just moving without causing more stress that they can recover from, is probably the best way to put it. Then I think step two is you start getting them using the limbs, right? Using the lower body in ways they're going to do the same thing, gradually reintroducing the lower body to the stress that it was able to do before, without, again, overstressing the movement pattern, or the ligaments and stuff that you're rehabbing. And again, this is where movement pattern exercise selection becomes so vital, and where you have to work with a therapist. But that's just progressing down this general to specific track, right? The first part's very, very general. In the middle part, I'm starting to now incorporate more lower body movements in ways that are going to gradually build up their functional capacity to move in ways they need to, without, again, overstressing it. And then the last part of the return to play, obviously, is doing it within the context of the specific loads, the specific movements, the specific work rest ratios, all those sorts of things, and making sure that you've recovered them correctly to be able to do that. But I always look at this from a standpoint of volume first, then intensity, because I want to gradually increase how much somebody can do before I make it harder. I think people will tend to overdo the intensity too early, and you lose the capacity to adapt to that if you haven't built the work capacity in terms of the volume first. So again, it's a very simple, like I said, broadly speaking, we're moving from very general exercises, very general movements, to much more specific movements in specific environments and specific levels of stress and load. And mostly, I'm just looking at what does the therapist, what does the ATC, what does that side of thing want in terms of limitations to movement patterns they don't want me to touch, they don't want me to do, and what are the things they really want to reinforce and have worked on. I think that's where the teamwork comes into play, is in that environment where you can have discussions about what exercises should we do here? What do you suggest? What do you want me to do? What do you want me to avoid? Those sorts of things. And those conversations don't happen a lot of times too. Unfortunately, in this world, if you're in a team setting, it can happen. But outside of team settings, a lot of times you just don't have the conversation between the strength conditioning or fitness and the therapist. And that's where you see, I think, problems, because the communication breaks down and the right volumes, intensities, exercises aren't used, and the right outcome doesn't always happen.
You did an excellent job highlighting the general principles, and by no means I expected a specific, hey, do this script for this many weeks or anything like that. I really want to just hear your perspective from a rehab side, and those that work in the performance therapy and PT space, just to hear your perspective as they think about increasing their return to training phases and starting to consider, return to sport criteria, what that even looks like, and how fitness needs to be a part of that. Joel, you run a lot of programs, some education, people to learn from you. And before we give a shout out to those and point people in the right direction, I have this final question when it comes to what you've seen through all of your education and experience. And, what is one common oversight that folks may make when it comes to designing a conditioning program?
That's a good question. I think the biggest thing I would say is progression. I think that if you're talking about strength coaches in general, or people in general, I think progression around strength training is much more discussed in terms of adding sets or adding reps or adding weight, decreasing rest intervals, all these sorts of things. From a strength perspective, progression is kind of baked into a lot of ways people program, but then progression on the conditioning side often isn't, because they don't really understand the importance, or maybe necessarily how to progress first the volume component by adding a few more minutes here and there and increasing the overall volume, and then maybe the frequency, and then starting to add in some more intensity, and then slowly ramping the intensity up. I think, unfortunately, for a long time, it's been too much of like kill yourself or just go easy. But there does have to be some balance between those two, and there has to be some progression to get there. And you can't start with, oh, okay, well, we're gonna do some conditioning, so now we're just gonna throw in some max intensity intervals at the end of our workout, or whatever. There has to be a progression, just like you wouldn't take somebody who is just getting back to lifting, or maybe a beginner, and you wouldn't say, okay, we're gonna do max effort today, we're gonna do singles and doubles and triples, that's where we're gonna start. You wouldn't do that, but then people will take conditioning and be like, we're going to get you back in shape, so we're going to do this all out 10-second interval today, like day one. Or, like there's just a lack of progression. And I think it's important to understand, just like you have to build a foundation for strength movements and strength training, you wouldn't start somebody out at day one, run at max as you're training. There has to be progression in the physiological side of conditioning too. So that is where zone 2 is a foundational piece. And that's where, as you start adding in the intensity, you start with lower intensities like tempo intervals and different types of intervals that are more moderate intensity. Then you gradually increase them, how much you can do of those. And then you start adding in higher intensities and then slight more volume of that. And then, so on and so forth. There has to be a logical progression with the conditioning side, just like there is a strength training side. Otherwise, you're missing the foundation. And I think that's what happens a lot of times is people get to a certain point in conditioning, like, I'm stuck. I can't seem to progress here. It's because they're lacking the foundation. You just didn't build the foundation by putting the volume and the progression to get you to a point where you could keep going. And, if you don't think about the long term, when you get to the long term, you're going to be stuck. That's what it comes down to.
I share that same sentiment. I appreciate you calling out the periodization of the fitness side of things. That is definitely something that's not, like you said, spoken about enough. And also, I've just observed similarly that as even in my own program, I often forget that sometimes too. So thank you.
I think it's human nature to be focused on the short term. And let's just say it, we're very short term oriented because that's what's in front of us, right? We can see the next week or 4 weeks or whatever, but it's much harder to put in the work, realizing that we might make lower or slower progress now in some capacity than longer progress or better progress over 6 months. I mean, if I had an athlete and they say, hey, I have to train for an event in 30 days, I'm going to train them very differently than an athlete comes and say, hey, my competition in 6 months. I would see less progress over the first 30 days because I'd sacrifice some of that progress for the long-term development. And unfortunately, we tend to operate in these very short windows of just forward thinking. We have to set goals, obviously, at these short-term periods. But if we're just training for tomorrow or the next 30 days, oftentimes, like I said, we're shortchanging the longer outcomes.
Yes. Thank you. Hey, Joel, like I said, I wanted to point people in the right direction to learn more. You've got Morpheus, you've got 8 weeks out, you have a couple different things that people can learn from you in different capacities. So could you provide some insights as to how people can learn more about what you're about and how they can educate themselves and just be better when it comes to the conditioning side?
Yeah, sure. 8weeksout.com is my main website, just number 8. Weeksout.com. I've got all sorts of different articles, videos. I've got my certification course, links to all my products around there. So that's probably the place to start. And then trainwithmorpheus.com is where Morpheus has got all the information about that, and they can order it. But again, 8weeksout.com, you can find basically everything from there, or Instagram, Coach Joel Jamieson as well. I've got links to different products and resources on Instagram as well. So either one or both of those will do the job.
I will make sure we include that. And so, Joel, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for just giving us a refresher on a lot of basic principles that are foundational for conditioning, but also sharing some more advanced insights into what we can start to look at to improve the overall conditioning. So thank you for your time, Joel.
No problem. Happy to come on and talk to your audience, and love to do it again sometime.